Why is it the case that we could say whenever there's a fantasy, there's two fantasies? This is one of the examples of the kind of odd mathematics, this is my joke, the odd mathematics of Lacanian psychoanalysis. When you have one fantasy, you automatically have two, the kind of non-mathematics of Lacanian analysis. So we've called it the two fantasies. This is the third in a series of talks on the topic of fantasy. And we want to try and say why this formulation is here and how we might account for it. In so doing, it helps to refer to one of the more puzzling texts within Freud. And every now and again, we're so used to finding Lacan being muddy, baroque, difficult, stylized, impossible to understand and read. It comes as a shock when there's something in Freud which is almost as tricky, is almost as difficult. But the famous paper, A Child is Being Beaten, is one of those rather challenging texts within Freud. I'm not going to involve us in a lengthy discussion of it, but I want to pull out two elements that he notes right at the beginning of that paper as a way of trying to foreground this question of the two fantasies. So, Freud, at the beginning of this paper, speaks of the fantasies, a kind of imaginary situation. And of course, as we've already suggested, there's this frequent style or pattern in psychoanalysis of thinking about the fantasy as a tableau, as a visual arrangement, as a scene, as a scenario, as indeed fundamentally visual. We still got to come back to that. But he says this: fantasy for Freud is considered, here's the quote, along the lines of, here's the quote, the vehicle of the excitation impelling towards masturbation. It arouses activities of the imagination. What's so interesting about this, for me at least, is that for Freud, the key to masturbation is not the physical act. Okay, it's not the actual physical act or the release or that activity, but the accompanying fantasy. It's the fantasy which makes masturbation masturbatory. That's kind of interesting. It seems to suggest then that if he's right, that one way of understanding fantasy is as this scene, this picturing, this stabilizing, indeed masturbatory kind of image which does a certain kind of work. Freud also wants to say that when we look at a fantasy, we see that it finds its way into a permanent possession of libidinal trends. In other words, it's kind of shaping, which links very well to what we've said before. But he also wants to note, somewhat surprisingly, that the fantasy inevitably conceals a traumatic dimension. It seems to serve a protective function. In other words, the masturbatory, alluring, protective, appealing element is one half of what's going on. But it seems that there's some kind of traumatic dimension there. Now, with those two facets in place, I think we're better able to understand why in Lacanian psychoanalysis, and certainly for Slavoj Žižek, you have fantasy 1 and fantasy 2. Let's make another point. Often, in the early days and many years after, actually, the aftermath of Freudian psychoanalysis, people were like, oh, it's all so sexual. Why the preponderance of sexuality? You know, Freud is sexually obsessed. Why so much sex in psychoanalysis? And I think now we're starting to get to a reason. Yeah, sex is important to human subjectivity and human life, obviously, but there's something else. It's not just sex in and of itself that makes it so important to psychoanalysis. One of the reasons that sex is so important to psychoanalysis is that sex is almost always on the verge of something traumatic. There's a little exercise I do with undergrad students, and I sometimes say, you know, well, okay, let's not be perverse or anything, but, you know, presumably any sexual activity that you might like. Why am I even telling this to undergrad students? I think I need to reevaluate my teaching strategy. I think now, we're starting now, okay, no more, we're not doing this anymore, except for this video, which means we're doing it much more, but whatever. Any pleasurable sexual interaction that you might be able to imagine. And let's keep it like all ages here, just kissing, okay? Nice kiss, very romantic kiss. You just have to alter one element, one dimension, one aspect of that scene, and it becomes traumatic. Like, we're kissing, it's nice, okay, oh, the person's not pulling away. Oh no, our braces are connected. Oh no, there's saliva in my mouth. Oh no, It's not my saliva, right? The point being, stupid example, but almost any facet of what is sexually enticing and enjoyable is also potentially too much, excessive. So, getting round then to the question of why are there two aspects to fantasy? Zizek puts it in these terms. Fantasy has two dimensions, he says. We have the consoling, beatific, appealing, the stabilizing element of fantasy. This I'm trying to link to Freud's masturbatory, pleasant, pleasurable, accommodating element of fantasy. And let's also just expand on that. Let's say that it could be not just the sexual fantasy, but maybe the fantasies one has before you fall asleep of like what's going to happen wonderfully in your career. That level is also phantasmatic, right? These kind of hopeful scenarios of what I could be, or what I might achieve, what I might have one day. That's one facet of fantasy. But it's underwritten and destabilized by a second facet, the traumatic, troubling element, the destabilizing element that we have. If we think about it in terms of the social political domain, again, we've just looked at it in a sexual example where there's something that's pleasing, beatific, stabilizing. In fact, maybe that's going to help me sleep better at night. There's like a slightly narcissistic, masturbatory element to that facet of fantasy. I can think about it and it gives me pleasure. The other facet we can see in political life as well. So the example Slavoj Žižek gives, we can expand upon it. He says, let's think about the era of National Socialism in Germany. Let's think about the ideology that the Nazis used. On the one hand, you've got some kind of beatific fantasy, the German folk, I don't have the language here or the ideology, but the image presumably of the motherland, or is it the fatherland? I think it's the fatherland. The fatherland of how wonderful we as the Aryan race could be, as some kind of the leading race on earth, which in us is all that is important and wonderful and civilized. All of those things. In other words, the stabilizing, narcissistic, appealing facet of the fantasy. But that doesn't happen alone. The fantasy has that dynamism, that subterranean secondary element where there is something that troubles me, where is something that's traumatic, which precisely destabilizes that top element. And in National Socialism, it is, of course, this anti-Semitic fixation on the troublesome Jewish person, who is the blight, the smudge on the landscape or something, which is ruining this for us. And you could say that theory, that conceptualization works very well in terms of how the phantasmatic narrative of racism works. Racism always seems to entail this: America was great, we can make America great again, we can be this homogenous, wonderful community with our conventional values, if only they weren't here. They need to be here. Or they are here, and I made a little slip when I said they need to be here, because I think that is, oddly enough, the inherent logic of fantasy. I want to complain about them who are damaging our educational system, who are living in the house next door and bringing down the property values. All of these facets. And I think Jean-Paul Sartre makes this point very nicely. I found the quote at some point. I don't know whether I brought it with me. But he says something like, the anti-Semite is in the curious position of being very dependent on precisely the thing that he complains about. And that, I think, is a nice way of showing how those two elements of the fantasy work together in this kind of dynamic way, whereby there is the thing that troubles me. And I'll extend the example just with one brief observation. Some years ago when I was living in the UK, Nick Griffith, I think, or Griffin, his name was. So he was a leader. He's kind of evaporated from public life these days, I think. But he was the leader of the British National Party, kind of neo-fascist or pretty close to being fascist, very right-wing party. And I heard him being interviewed one day, and he was saying, you don't realize, but the Islamic threat, fundamentalism, is creeping all the way through British life. Within 15 years, the majority of people in this country will be Asian and they will be Muslim fundamentalists, something like this. And I always thought this was so curious, because I thought the whole idea of white supremacy was that, like, inherently you believe that Aryans, back to the Nazi thing, or white people are so inherently superior, right? Isn't that the plot here? they're so much more clever, they've got such better culture, they're so superior in every facet. If that's so, your rationality, your logic seems to undercut itself almost completely because you're very scared of Islam, or you're very scared of people of color. How does that work? And it seemed to me such a massive contradiction of his own discourse, in a way, contradicting his assertion, the stance, the phantasmatic assertion, the narcissistically appealing assertion of one's own superiority. But now it seems to make sense to me. Those two pieces hold one another in place. Because yes, we are apparently superior, but that's why we're doing what we're doing, because we're troubled by this other facet of the fantasy, which seems to be increasingly engendered precisely by the assertion of superiority. So that's one way of thinking the two facets of fantasy. And just before we bring this session to a close, let's also just return back to the point that I avoided or bypassed, the idea that fantasy teaches us how to desire. Early on in the Seven Veils of Fantasy, when Zizek is giving us his overview of the seven, what he takes to be, from a Lacanian perspective, seven very fundamental dimensions or aspects of fantasy, he sets it out quite clearly, and he says, what we often think is that fantasy is the kind of add-on, that we've got certain desires, and then we have fantasy as the kind of screen, the imagining, the happy thing that allows me to, as it were, picture my desire. And he says, no, from a Lacanian perspective, you've got it completely wrong. Desire doesn't come first. Fantasy is the thing, and he even uses this line. It literally teaches us how to desire. Fantasy is what teaches us how to desire, which arranges desire. And also, we start to see this in Lacan's own formulations. We have a sense of that, not only fantasy being this kind of domesticating, arranging of jouissance, arranging of sexuality, locating us with relationship to it, but it's also the thing that keeps desire going. It's almost as if there's a sense that outside of fantasy, desire might kind of start to shrivel up a little bit. Fantasy enables desire to continue. So we'll speak a little bit more about that when we follow up on this in the next talk, but let's just keep that idea in mind, that fantasy teaches us how to desire, which then brings with it the question of, or the idea that there isn't a preset object of desire. And here's a nice kind of opposition in order to affirm that. You could say that in the natural domain, in the natural animal domain of instincts, there is an object. There is a natural object. Human beings, as we've tried to argue from a psychoanalytic perspective, don't have enough of an instinctual apparatus, or they are not fully defined by nature. So whereas in the natural world we have instincts with a natural object, for human subjectivity, there isn't a natural object. And even if you don't much like psychoanalysis, you know that's true because people have all sorts of different types of object, right? And some people are gay, and some people are straight, and some people are doing all sorts of different things. You could argue that there's a kind of plasticity that defines the object. And of course, what psychoanalysis will say then, and what Lacanian psychoanalysis will say, then in the natural domain of instincts, there is a natural object. But for human psychical subjectivity, there isn't a natural object. All there is a fantasy object. And we could also elaborate and say the object cause of desire. Let's end with that thought.